Thank you for joining us tonight. We are currently playing our pre-event slideshow. Gold text on a white background, live from NYPL logo. Live from NYPL presents Political Roundtable with the New York Review of Books. Jamelle Bouie, Pamela Karlan, Lilla, Timothy Snyder, and Brenda Wineapple. October 15th, 2020 at 7 p.m. EDT. Black text on a white background. Read, think, vote. Make an informed decision. Read as if your vote depends on it. NYPL's 2020 election reading list is available at nypl.org/election2020. Find accessible versions of these books at bit.ly/accessible-election-reads. This slide features a blue box with a line of red, white, and blue stars running across the middle, and images of 12 different book jackets from the election reading list, including America for Americans, Our Time is Now, The End of Vice, Begin Again, No Justice in the Shadows, This Changes Everything, Drawing the Vote, Unrigged, Good Talk, Give Us the Ballot, Why We're Polarized, and Push Out. Black text on a white background, live from NYPL upcoming events. Tuesday, October 20th at 8 p.m. EDT. Conditional Citizens, Lilla Lalami with Fatima Bhutto. Reflecting on her own journey from Moroccan immigrant to U.S. citizen, award-winning novelist Lilla Lalami examines where the boundaries of Americanness lie. Monday, October 26th at 8 p.m. EDT. Malcolm X, The Facts and the Fictions. Discover the monumental new biography of one of the 20th century's most relevant figures 30 years in the making. The Dead Are Arising, featuring Tamara Payne and Reverend Calvin O. Butts III. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are currently playing our pre-event slideshow. Gold text on a white background, live from NYPL logo. Live from NYPL presents Political Roundtable with the New York Review of Books. Jamelle Bouie, Pamela Karlan, Lilla, Timothy Snyder, and Brenda Wineapple. October 15th, 2020 at 7 p.m. EDT. Black text on a white background. Read, think, vote. Make an informed decision. Read as if your vote depends on it. NYPL's 2020 election reading list is available at nypl.org/election2020. Find accessible versions of these books at bit.ly/accessible-election-reads. This slide features a blue box with a line of red, white, and blue stars running across the middle, and images of 12 different book jackets from the election reading list, including America for Americans, Our Time is Now, The End of Vice, Begin Again, No Justice in the Shadows, This Changes Everything, Drawing the Vote, Unrigged, Good Talk, Give Us the Ballot, Why We're Polarized, and Push Out. Black text on a white background, live from NYPL upcoming events. Tuesday, October 20th at 8 p.m. EDT. Conditional Citizens, Lilla Lalami with Fatima Bhutto. Reflecting on her own journey from Moroccan immigrant to U.S. citizen, award-winning novelist Lilla Lalami examines where the boundaries of Americanness lie. Monday, October 26th at 8 p.m. EDT. Malcolm X, The Facts and the Fictions. Discover the monumental new biography of one of the 20th century's most relevant figures 30 years in the making. The Dead Are Arising, featuring Tamara Payne and Reverend Calvin O. Butts III. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live.
Hi, everyone. I am Faye Rosenfeld, and I'm the Vice President of Public Programs at the New York Public Library. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Political Roundtable with the New York Review of Books. We have an all-star group of writers, thinkers, and scholars with us for this conversation. Pamela Karlan, Jamelle Bouie, Mark Lilla, Timothy Snyder, and our moderator, Brenda Wineapple. Their bios are in the event listing on the library's website, so in the interest of time, I won't repeat them, but we really couldn't think of a better group of people to talk about and hopefully help us make some sense of our current political moment. I want to thank the co-editors of the New York Review, Emily Greenhouse and Gabe Winslow Yost, as well as editor-at-large Daniel Mendelsohn, for helping to put this program together. We're very, very lucky at the library to have a long history of partnering with the New York Review of Books, and also to have the review's archives in our collections. But I think that all of us are truly fortunate to be able to rely on the New York Review of Books as a trusted source for insight and inspiration in these very, very challenging times that we're living through. In a minute, I'm going to bring our panelists to the screen. Before I do that, I have just a few quick housekeeping notes. First, I am required to tell you that tonight's conversation is being recorded. That's not any of you, obviously, just those of us who are up here on screen. Second, our panelists will take your questions at the end. If you have a question, you can ask it at any time during the program by typing it into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom app, or into the YouTube chat if you're watching us there, or by sending an email to publicprograms@nypl.org. We'll make sure that the panelists see your questions. Also at the end, you'll see a very quick 2-question survey that we hope you'll take a few minutes to answer. Real-time captions are available for tonight's program via stream text. You'll find the link in the reminder email that you received after signing up for the event, as well as in the chats in Zoom and in YouTube. Finally, we hope that you'll join us for some of our upcoming programs. Next Tuesday, October 20th, Lilla will join us to talk about her new book, Conditional Citizens, on Belonging in America, and she'll be speaking with Fatima Bhutto. And the following week, on October 26th, Tamara Payne will speak with the Reverend Calvin O. Butts III about The Dead Are Arising, the posthumously released biography of Malcolm X. This is a book that her late father, the journalist Les Payne, worked on for 3 decades, and it's now a finalist for the National Book Award. You can find all these events and more by going to nypl.org/live. And now it is my pleasure to turn things over to our moderator, Brenda Wineapple, to kick our program off.
Are we all here? Yeah. I think we're missing one of our panelists. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, this brilliant panel. I'm just going to outline the method to moderating madness tonight, especially since we are these days confronting racial crisis, healthcare and public health crises, climate crises, potential constitutional crises, foreign policy crises, the legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the media. And since one topic bleeds into the other, and it's a mess, this panel is going to straighten it all out by 8 o'clock. So with that, I'm going to direct some early questions to each of the panelists, but of course, everyone on the panel is free to jump in. And I'm going in the true time honored way of alphabetical. So Jamelle, I'm starting with you, and I'm starting with a little bit of weird history that some people may or may not know, and that is in 1866, Congress actually reduced the number of Supreme Court justices from 9 to 7, all right, to prevent the first ever to be impeached president and white supremacist Andrew Johnson from adding people to the court. After Grant was elected, they put it back to 9. We were all familiar, or some of us familiar with FDR and courts, but you recently wrote a really interesting op-ed about how Democrats should fight fire with fire and add justices to the Supreme Court. So a couple of questions that I have to start. One of the pushbacks you might get is this too much politicizing of the court? This is not me asking, this is because I already have my answer. And then in relation to that, this is, I think, hasn't come up quite as much, but you think lifetime appointments to the court should be revisited?
So first, thank you to the New York Public Library. Thank you to the New York Review
Oh,
of
I
Books.
forgot.
for doing this. This is really great. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So on the politicizing the court point, the court is a political institution. I think when people say politicizing the court, I think what they mean is, are you making the court partisan? I think you can make a case that the court has been partisan quite a bit over its history, that the times we think of the court being nonpartisan or thinking beyond sort of ideological interests represent exceptions to the rule. But I don't think court expansion should necessarily be thought of as a move that sort of politicizes the court where it wasn't politicized. I think we should think of court expansion or something like jurisdiction stripping, which the Congress is empowered to do under Article 3, as recognizing that the court does not actually exist outside of the system of checks and balances. I think there's a broad conception, right? When you teach kids in grade school about the checks and balances of the American government, it is the president checks the Congress checks the president, the courts check the elected officials. But the design of American government is such that actually the elected officials check the courts as well. And in the early American Republic, there was an understanding, there was an idea that the courts are not above sort of the public. They're not, they may be able to comment on the meaning of the Constitution, what the elected officials were doing, but they're not somehow above the entire system itself. And so I think my sort of like meta argument, because I've been writing about this across a number of different columns, and then also on Twitter informally, is that we need to think of the court as being an institution that is in need of being checked, that we have, I think, given entirely too much power to the judiciary to determine what the Constitution means. And while the judiciary does have that authority does not rest solely with the judiciary. The people can interpret the Constitution, our elected officials can interpret the Constitution. And I think we're coming to a point where there are going to be rival and conflicting interpretations of the Constitution. And we should be prepared to push back on what the court says the Constitution means.
Well, that's really interesting. And in that regard, too, I guess I have to turn to inevitably Pam, on this, topic as well, because, one of the things you wrote recently after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, it was really kind of, I thought, quite beautiful when you quoted her, quoted her saying, "Fight for the things you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you," and it was very touching and moving. And to me, I guess there's a kind of incrementalism that she was promoting and suggesting. And I'm wondering, in light of what Jamelle's saying too, is that possible in today's court as it's conceived, to be able to do that, do you think?
So, I think you have to think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg both as a justice on the Supreme Court, but before that as an activist. And I think some of what Jamelle's point is we make the courts as much as the courts make us. And we are coming to the end of a period that I think is the lifetimes of all of the people in the audience and all of us, in which the court was thought of generally as a potentially progressive institution. That is not over American history, where the court has been for most of American history. And so if you think back to the Lochner era at the turn of the 20th century, the court was in there striking down labor laws, striking down laws about unionization, making it harder to have public health laws and the like. And we may see the court in that position again, which requires a political movement to change how we elect officials, and by changing who the elected officials are, changing the courts. It takes a long time. It took a long time for us to get to where we are now, and it will take a long time to kind of bring the court back around to being more of a progressive institution.
Yeah. Well, Mark, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I'm wondering whether Pam and Jamelle are on the same page on this, because what I just understood from Pam is that it takes a long time to change, because one has to win elections in order to then appoint judges. And the Republicans have done a very good job of building up a whole legal machine, beginning with the Federalist Society and summer camps for young conservatives, in order to get where they've gotten. But I thought Jamelle was making a different argument, which is that, if I understood you, that we've given too much power to the courts. And so that argument sounds a lot like arguments beginning in the 1980s with people like Bork and Scalia, that in fact, we've kind of abdicated our democratic responsibilities in the legislative branch and shunted things over to the judiciary, and that needs to be corrected, and to have a more political system. Is that your position?
That is my position. That's right. I sort of broadly think that one of the critical problems facing American government right now is this lack of activity isn't even the right word. Just sort of, it's not energetic across all fields. American government is sluggish. It is unwilling to act, and I think this is the thing, especially in the past decade, which has resulted in both the executive accumulating lots of influence and sort of autonomy, and then the courts also doing the same. And to my mind, kind of the problem here is that Congress is not really acting as it was supposed to. So I see, there's a sense in which I think that as much as I think that court expansion is a necessary tactic, essentially to say to conservative Republicans that we understand that you've wanted to make the courts into this sort of ideological redoubt, but the courts should not serve that purpose. And so we're just going to nullify the whole thing together to show you that you can't do this and that your deal with Trump to make this happen was unacceptable. I think it's very much a tactical thing. Thinking over the long term, the only solution to the problem of, a potential judgeocracy is an energetic Congress, that at the end of the day, a Congress that is acting regularly and doing what it's supposed to do in our constitutional system is the thing that is going to keep things in balance. And I think progressives should want that. I think the progressive agenda depends on an active Congress, on active representation, on all these sort of substantive lowercase d democratic things in a way that the conservative agenda simply does not.
But there's one thing that I think we need to really kind of separate out, which is the courts in their capacity as interpreting the Constitution, where I'm with Jamelle. And then the other thing is the courts enforcing the laws that Congress wrote. So you can't say, for example, we need to get the courts out of the business of hearing Section 1983 cases about police brutality. You can't get the courts out of the business of hearing employment discrimination cases. If the Supreme Court strikes down the Affordable Care Act this winter, they're not going to be doing it on constitutional grounds. They're going to be doing it on statutory grounds, on their, I think, totally erroneous, on what would be a totally erroneous and totally disingenuous statutory interpretation of a technical point of what's called severability law. So it's not, even if you could get the courts to be less imperialistic about the Constitution, there's still this question of how the courts are going to enforce the laws that come through Congress. When, we're having problems now with the question of how to enforce the Voting Rights Act. Well, Congress wrote that statute. It's not that we don't have the statute. It's we don't have a court that's prepared to enforce that statute in its fullest sense.
Well, in terms of tactics going forward, is it possible, or is it a good tactic to put out there maybe lifetime appointments are not the best thing because it kind of calcifies the court in a certain sense? I mean, I can see a counter argument is people on the court who don't have to then toady to the person who put them on there, then can change their opinions. Although I don't know in history if that's happened all that much, in that particular case. Well, given that, I want to just change the sort of focus a little bit and, to the language, because Mark, you write about language often and very eloquently, and the role of language in public discourse, is so important. And so to just kind of segue from the court, not too far from it, this notion of quote unquote packing the court, really bothers me, because in point of fact, it has a kind of ideological valence with it. When you're packing something, it's, you know, it sounds very negative, as opposed to rethinking, judicial roles in that particular sense. So I was wondering, what your thoughts about how we change that kind of public discourse, or if it's at all possible. Right.
Well, I think, I mean, you can find another word for packing, but it is packing. Because the motivation, as we've just heard, as we've been talking, the motivation is not because we've sort of rethought the system. And if it is, we need to justify why we would need more judges and not say less, because we could also go in the other direction somehow.
Right.
No, the motivation, which is totally understandable and just, is what happened with Garland. And so the need to kind of, remove that stain from the court, I think, is justifiable motive. But we shouldn't use euphemisms. If what they're trying to do is pack the courts by keeping a president, scandalously keeping a president from being able to have a nominee voted on, then you have to respond in kind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But yeah, no, absolutely. And but I'm still interested in the role of language in that particular sense, because you do get these, what we all know now as sound bites that really have a kind of ideological baggage, regardless. I mean, after the last presidential debate, and it's worth noting that was supposed to be another one tonight, but after the last one, there were a number of commentators were saying, well, Biden didn't answer the question about packing the court, and just the use of that particular language was already putting a kind of point of view about that. And but in any event, one of the things that, Mark, I'll continue with you for a second. One of the things that your most recent book, the Once and Future Liberal, has been quoted. You've been quoted a lot with the kind of phrase, "We need no more marches, we need more mayors." And I was wondering, I mean, when you wrote that, as opposed to now, do you think there's been a renewed political activism? It's kind of what Jamelle is talking about, and go ahead.
Yeah, well, of course, what I meant by no more didn't mean to stop them. I was saying additional ones, right? Well, actually, this connects a bit to what Jamelle was just saying, and that is the kind of way in which our political system has been, in a sense, depoliticized. Right. And so people think of political activity as either filing a brief and going to the Supreme Court and running around Congress, or on the other hand, going to the streets or going on the internet in order to have some effect on public opinion. But the central questions that matter, especially regarding race, require that Democrats hold institutional power in an unbroken way in the institutions.
Working from within the institutions.
Take the question of police brutality. If you want to change police behavior, to begin with, you need new police chiefs. Well, who hires new police chiefs? It's mayors who are elected officials, or it's county commissioners. If you want to prosecute police officers, that's normally a decision of the attorney general, state attorney general. That person is in certain states voted in or appointed by a governor who is elected. So the incredible surge of energy and care, and totally surprised me, the sense of social solidarity after the George Floyd killing. It was a remarkable moment. But that is not going to change things on the ground unless people put in the effort to get elected. And that means not only elected by larger margins in blue states, it means going to red states and winning them back. And part of that task is, one, to have a new Voting Rights Act the day after President Biden is signed in. Laws on redistricting, if we can do that. And we need people to go and help Black candidates for office win. And what I find particularly frustrating, you must have seen this on somewhere in a video. There was that incident when a group of young, mainly white kids in black t-shirts were harassing people in a restaurant in Adams Morgan in Washington, trying to get everyone there to raise their fist as a sign of solidarity. Now, when people were fighting for voters' rights at the end of the 50s and into the 60s, white college students got on a bus and they went there physically. They didn't sit behind their computers or stage street theater. They went and they put their bodies on the line, they put their time on the line, and they fought for concrete political power. And what I worry about is that apart from all the good things that came out of this summer, is that it will encourage a kind of style of engagement that is not what we need if we want real concrete change right now.
There was also, I agree with you, but there was also a lot of guerrilla theater that was, in a sense, an aspect of what you're talking about, the people going up to other people and kind of intimidating them. What there wasn't is constant media coverage of something like that, so that really makes a difference. But it's interesting when you talk about, the need for social solidity, and certainly in terms of police brutality and the kind of racial injustice we saw, that the two issues that one that comes to mind directly for Timothy, for you, recently you had a, really difficult and heart-wrenching battle with the healthcare system. And one of the things, quite apart from your own, difficult experience, one of the things that you noticed, and I think, is that that the issue of racial justice and systematic racism was really built right into the hospitals. It's you've got people marching because of the murder of George Floyd and the murder of so many people, but at a more almost mundane level. I was very struck by what you found in the hospital, where I think your physician was an African-American woman, and she wasn't really being listened to. It was really kind of stunning. Did you ever talk with her about it? And, is there a way that will combine, and because that brings us, of course, to the healthcare, crisis and the pandemic?
Well, what I realized as an American white person who was almost dead is that our awareness of race goes all the way down. So when I was not capable of thinking about much else, and when I was really just thinking about trying to stay alive, my mind was still intricately working around the issue of race. So the kind person that you mentioned was a friend of mine who spent those 17 hours with me in the emergency room. She was not my physician. She was a physician who chose to be with me. And during that time, my brain, which was completely unfiltered, right? Because I was just about gone, was obsessing about whether her badge was out. Right? Like a classic African-American issue. If her badge is out, then maybe other doctors will listen to her, but it's freezing cold. It's Saturday night. It's an emergency room. She's got her fleece zipped up, and so they can't see her badge. And that's what my mind is working on. And then, outside the emergency room, there are two cops, and one of them is talking about African-Americans as unpeople. And then deeper into the emergency room, there are several young African-American men who need attention in a way which is urgent and also demanding of the energy of the physicians around me. all that's going on. And then we're at the beginning of this pandemic, which if you adjust for age is going to kill Black people at a rate 4 times greater than white people. But this, I mean, this experience, this goes a bit to Mark's comments. This experience was also one which reminded me of how important physicality actually is to politics. I mean, one of the basic ways I think we go wrong when we talk about rights in this country is that we leave out the body. You know, we let the body go into the realm of the market. We make it too easy for, you know, some people to think, well, other people's bodies don't deserve the same kind of attention that maybe my body does. And there's a fundamental, I mean, you ask about problems and solutions. I think there's a fundamental American trick here, which is that if you don't think about rights as including your body, if your body is in some sense a commodity, which it is in our system of commercial medicine. I mean, the reason why I'm a privileged person. Lots of people get sick all the time. People die for very stupid reasons. I was in the hospital for stupid reasons, which had to do with the fact that commercial medicine kept pushing me out when I needed to be in and not letting me in when I needed to be in. But my point here is that if we treat the body as something about which we have rights, in other words, if we start with the idea that access to healthcare is a right and not a privilege and not a benefit, then we can get closer to a system where we start from the assumption that everybody is included. And I think in a whole lot of ways, not just in terms of our health, but in terms of how we feel about one another as Americans, that would be a very good thing.
Yeah, because what you talked about is how people get preferential treatment in a, you know, in an unequal health system, and then sort of you creating 2 different kinds of worlds. And I guess that goes back around to the courts again, but I don't want to quite go there yet. Back to the courts. What I wanted to stay with you for a second, Timothy, because you're less known for that horrific experience than your writing on tyranny. And, you know, we can't have a panel discussion, you know, 19 days before an election without talking about tyranny, not just vote, you know, all the aspects, voter suppression, everything that we've mentioned, and a kind of tyranny. And one of the things that you said, it's a scary but a nice line, you know, it says that, you know, in the history of tyranny, the government becomes the bodyguard of the gangster. And, you know, one of the issues, it seems to me, that really you said that really Trump has spelled out what his intention is to do. And as I said, that gets us back to the courts, you know, to basically get rid of claim fraud from the ballots, you know, declare victory regardless, expect state governments to, you know, act contrary to vote counts, to, you know, court chaos from white nationalists, and then expect the Supreme Court with a new, you know, new person seated on it to install. And I was wondering if that explains, if that's the case, and maybe you could elaborate on it, it explains why Trump is so determined just to speak to his base and not to the so-called, if it exists, undecided voter, the moderate voter, the independent voter.
Okay, I'm gonna try to make a segue which you didn't make, and I'm gonna suggest.
I don't like moderating. You do.
I want to suggest that the 2 questions are actually related. That healthcare in this country is actually directly related to the possibility of the collapse of democracy. I think when we compete with one another for healthcare, which we do, we're less patriotic. We're less capable of regarding our fellow citizens as our fellow people. When we know that our healthcare depends on somebody else not getting healthcare, then we're less patriotic. We're less good at participating in civil society. And when in a situation like this year, but it's true all the time, just more intensely this year, the lack of universal healthcare pumps fear and anxiety into the society and into the polity, which a very clever politician like Mr. Trump is perfectly capable of directing other ways, right? So one of the reasons why this moment we're talking about is so fraught is because there's so much anxiety and confusion and contestation around illness, which for the most part is actually totally unnecessary. It didn't have to happen. So let me continue with the point that Mr. Trump is smart. He is, I mean, I think a lot of folks, you know, on the left dismiss him in ways he shouldn't be dismissed. He's quite intelligent. He's got tremendous political talent. It's an unfamiliar kind of political talent. I would venture the supposition that he has known since June at the latest that he was not going to win this election. The gesture of June 1st to the armed forces is not the gesture of somebody who thinks he's going to win. The tweet of 30 July, let's delay the elections, that's not the gesture of somebody who thinks he's going to win. All of these things, asking his supporters to vote twice, asking for intimidation, they can all be read as confessions that he doesn't think he's going to win. I think that we're in a typical authoritarian situation in two ways. It's typical in terms of the candidate. It's typical in authoritarian countries for the candidate to think that his choice is between the poorhouse or the White House. I mean, it's typical to think that the choice is I die in prison or I die in my comfortable bed. For Trump, who owes $500 million, which he can't pay off, and who has now been very carefully investigated for crimes that he almost certainly committed, he knows that he's in that authoritarian situation. Americans are a little slow to pick up on this, but when you're outside the US, everybody sees it. Everybody, if you're in Russia, Ukraine, everybody sees that this is where he is.
If he leaves the White House, right.
And then the other way that this is a typical authoritarian situation is that elections aren't just elections. Elections are occasions to do other things. And so I want to agree with the premise of your question. I don't think Mr. Trump is trying to win this election. I don't think he's even trying to win the electoral college part of it. I think he's aiming to get enough of his, knowing that he's going to lose because he's smart and he can read polls and he can read the mood, knowing that he's going to lose, he's aiming to get enough of his supporters angry enough that they can play a part in the managed chaos of November, which he imagines will somehow allow him to stay in power. And that managed chaos, I'll now segue back to the court, is about intimidating the Supreme Court or about giving the Supreme Court a pretext or an excuse to do something which obviously it shouldn't do.
Well, of course, that's terrifying. And I'm going to throw it back to you, Pam. You know, I mean, do you think that the Supreme Court can and will be intimidated in that way? That,
you know, I'd like to add one thing to the list of evidence that Trump thinks he's going to lose, which is ramming Amy Coney Barrett through right now.
Exactly. No,
if you thought you were going to win, you might say, here's the person I'm going to nominate, re-elect me, and I promise to nominate her.
Exactly.
But if you think you're going to be out of there on January 20th,
then have 8. You've
got to grab everything now, right? You're in what's called in game theory, the last period problem, which is, you know, there's not going to be another round after this. So the question is, you know, can he intimidate the Supreme Court? I don't think it's so much can he intimidate the Supreme Court as the worldview of people who think that the problem with American elections is fraud rather than a lack of full participation. So, you know, since 2000, this is not something that was true, you know, in the period, say, between 1980 and 2000, but since 2000, we've been in a period where Republicans purport to see fraud everywhere in the election system. There's no evidence of this fraud. You know, Trump put together a commission led by Chris Kobach, the ultimate fraud seeker, and they couldn't find Jack. And the reason they couldn't find Jack is that the level of fraud in American elections is quite low. And almost all of the fraud that we have is fraud that involves local elections where swinging 50 or 100 or 150 votes will determine who gets to be on the school board or who gets to be the road commissioner. But what happens is that you have a Supreme Court now and we're seeing this in case after case that's going up there on what's called the shadow docket. That is cases where they don't hear oral argument, they just rule in these kind of snap rulings late at night. We're seeing case after case where the Supreme Court is refusing to acknowledge the fact that COVID changes the voting ability of lots of people. So, you know, a district court judge in South Carolina said, we can't require people to have witnesses for their ballots in COVID era, because if you're locked up at home, maybe you don't have anybody who can do this. Supreme Court reimposed that. The state of Texas A district judge said, given the COVID problem, even people under the age of 65 should have the right to vote, no excuse, vote by mail ballots. The Supreme Court refused to allow that to go into effect. And they're doing this again and again and again. So I don't think they're being intimidated into doing this. I think they are fundamentally out of sympathy with the idea that every American citizen who's eligible should be able to cast a ballot and have it counted.
I mean, that's really shocking.
Yeah.
When I mean, at that level, it's unbelievable, really. I mean, it gets back to, I guess, going around again. It gets back also to the question, sort of in an indirect way, the electoral college too, although it's moot in the conversation we're having now.
The electoral college is less our problem than the Senate.
Then
the electoral college is less of a problem than the Senate, because there are fundamental changes going on in American demography, so that in the next 20 years, 70% of Americans are going to live in 15 states, which means 70% of Americans will elect 30 senators, and the other 30% of Americans will elect 70 senators. And what that means, especially given the way that people are sorting themselves demographically and the like, is that you are not going to have a country with the potential even for majority rule.
No, it's minority rule in that particular.
Even if we don't end up with tyranny, we will end up with minority control, numerical minority control. And that numerical minority is going to be whiter than America as a whole. And it's going to be more conservative than America as a whole.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's I don't know what to say, but if the question is, putative fraud, pretend fraud, if it's a question of sort of skewed demographics and, changing the Senate. I mean, it's also, I just want to bring it and maybe go back to Jamelle from a different point of view, because you work for a major media organization or organizations, and how responsible really is the media for this? I mean, one of the things that's so weird to me is the fact that they're going with these 2 town halls tonight. I mean, that from my sort of elegantly put vantage point, that's nuts. I mean, right? I mean, what, people are going to tape one and watch the other? I don't think so. I mean, so in a sense, we're sort of building this right in. And then to go to Timothy's point too, when you say, Tim was saying, from the vantage point of Europe, everybody understands the gangster in the White House doesn't want to wind up in the clink, basically. But there's no vantage from Europe coming in through the media. Media doesn't even cover what's going on in most places these days. The fact that, that the president of Kyrgyzstan resigned yesterday after protests, things like that. So I'm wondering, when I'm listening to all this, I'm thinking, yes, political process, yes, getting the Senate changed, yes, more sort of activism at not just the polls, but in terms of political action. But how I guess the simplest way to put this is, how do you change minds? I mean, you're trying, aren't you, Jamelle?
I suppose. It's an interesting question because, if you're thinking in terms of what is driving everything in American society, American politics right now, obviously, some portion of it has to do with the media, has to do with all sorts of media outlets and the ways in which Americans are getting information and understanding their place vis-a-vis each other, understanding how other citizens see them and how they see other citizens. But I think that if you zoom out even further, and I want to get back to something Tim said when he started about the body and politics. So that just got me thinking about the ways in which you can think of a political society as a body. That's like the famous metaphor of Leviathan, right? This giant body. And it seems to me that what we've been seeing in American life for a long time, but really acutely in the last 15 years or so, is the extent to which it's become clear, like just unmistakable, that people who were once relegated outside the body of American society, whether they are Hispanic immigrants or Hispanics in general, whether they are African Americans, whether they're LGBTQ people, just go down the list. People who existed, people who we have granted them, rights to participate, but who were understood broadly to kind of not really represent what the body is. It's clear that that's no longer the case, that they are kind of the American public now, or they will be the American public. And I think that, Trump, for example, the recent among some conservatives kind of vogue for saying, the United States isn't really a democracy, we're a republic. We have no obligation to kind of democratic processes. I think these sorts of things are all attempts to deal with the fact that as the body of America changes over time, certain things will no longer be live political options. That the kind of, small government ideological conservatism may actually not be viable anymore in this changed America. And so what the political struggle is how do we either cut off that part of the body that we do not want to be there, whether that's disenfranchisement or closing down the borders or doing whatever to kind of keep those people out or subordinate, or how do we reconfigure our bodies such that we no longer have to rely on that part? Meaning, how can we build minority rule? How can we build out institutions that preclude this from happening? And that to me is sort of the grounds on which American politics is being contested right now, which means I don't think that there's no easy solution to that, right? It's something that we may have to kind of pass through and hope that the tumult from it isn't so destructive that it ends up taking down the body itself altogether.
Well, Mark, I'm going to throw it over to you then. I mean, is there some way you can, Tim, did you want to say something?
If I could just roll off that.
So much for you, Mark, sorry.
No, I want to come back then.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Just rolling off that a little bit, I think there's also a metaphor of a mind that we could talk about. I mean, when you ask a question to a journalist, like it's hard for the journalist to say, it's not our fault, so I'm going to say it. Our problem isn't that we don't have enough journalists. Our problem is not that we have too many, it's that we don't have enough journalists. I mean, one of the major developments in the US in the last 15 years is the loss of local journalism. And most of the country is now a news desert. That 70%, that 30% of the population that's going to vote for 70% of the senators is basically one big news desert at this point. And that means that, going to earlier to something that Mark said, we don't actually know very much about the Black Lives Matter protests because they were so widespread. And anything which is widespread in this country can't be covered because we don't have local news. One of the reasons why the pandemic was so bad is that we didn't have local reporters covering hospitals the way we would have. And one of the reasons why our politics is so rotten is that people make their way up now. The new generation of politicians makes their way up now for local, municipal, county, state politics without reporters ever investigating them. And in a broader way, not having local news means that people immediately turn to national news or to conspiracy theories. They have fewer things that hold them together at a local level. So I just want to make a push for one of the big factors being the mind, that without local factuality, it's hard to have a national mind.
Okay, it's a good point. Mark, you had something you wanted to say too. So.
Yeah, well, I want to push back a little bit on Jamelle's point about there being a new body politic. One thing I've noticed just being in the academy over the past 20 or 30 years is how an interest after the 70s in marginalized people, which was a moral concern, has led to an overestimation of the number of people there are and of their historical significance in the past. And so students end up coming out of university with a distorted sense of what the country actually looks like. they've spent so much time thinking about marginalized groups that distorts their picture of the bigger America out there. I've tried a couple times to have my students guess how many transgender Americans there are, and the answer is less than 1/2% for the last time that Pew looked at these things, right? But when it comes to evangelicals, that's about 1 in 5 Americans. And so I asked my students, which group did you learn the most about in college? And they laugh because they know the answer is they learn more about these marginal groups than they have about American evangelicals. And given the problems in the Electoral College and the Senate, and given the sorting that's going on, and given, there's a new book by Richard Alba on this, the fact that most young people who were born of with a double ancestry tend to identify more as white. This is going to be a white country for quite a while in terms of political power. And what that means is that one still has to focus on convincing white Americans to show a sense of solidarity, to vote Democratic, to vote their interests when it comes to healthcare and everything else, and not try to separate ourselves out and wait for the boat to come in with a new population, because it's not very soon. And in terms of power, it's certainly not coming very soon.
Just to clarify, I wasn't necessarily making a point about political power. I was making a point about perception of the kind of cultural nature of the country. For the sake of example, in Wisconsin, which is sort of a mostly white state, conservative politics in Wisconsin is often focused on denigrating Madison and Milwaukee, both mostly white cities, not particularly diverse places, but places that in the conservative Wisconsinite imagination are, Schenectady's for minorities, for Blacks, for liberals, white liberals, and for sort of cultural elites. And I think that's the thing which is, when I say that, part of the body appears foreign to many Americans, that's what I mean, right? Not just non-whites, who are, I think at the moment, a third of the American public. And you're right, given intermarriage, given demographic trends, given the fact that, some percentage of, say, Hispanic Americans do understand themselves as being white and not as belonging to a race called Hispanic. I think your observations about sort of like what demographics mean for politics are correct, but I don't think that changes the extent to which for many Americans, even that future looks threatening, because that future may still be culturally quite different, right? It's still a figure like Barack Obama, who is in some sense very establishmentarian, very kind of lowercase c conservative, very much in the tradition of American politics, appears to a lot of people to be hopelessly radical, precisely not because of what he does or even because of who he is, because he represents a different picture of America that some Americans believe does not include them. And so to make this not just sort of disagreement, but like a disagreement agreement Oreo or something, I'll say that part of the political task is going to be persuading those Americans that they do actually have a place in this America, that even as cultural mores change, even as what, the median American, what that looks like is a little different than it was, instead of Italian last names, Hispanic last names or Asian last names, that people who consider themselves quote unquote traditional Americans are still very much part of this society and still very much have a claim on this society.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And it sort of connects to something else that I was thinking about as we were talking, and Tim might have some thoughts about this. I was so struck and moved by what happened this summer and the demonstrations, and the fact that, I read a lot of foreign newspapers, and there were demonstrations around the world, and I looked at where there were demonstrations in support of BLM and George Floyd. There were demonstrations in Kazakhstan, Japan, Korea, Sri Lanka, Iran, Israel, Poland, and other places. So there's a sense in which, and for example, the gay rainbow flag is an American invention, but it's become a universal symbol. It's recognizable everywhere in the world right now. So there's a sense there of sort of one population that's transnational that feels a great sense of solidarity among themselves. And then there are the white nationalist identitarians who feel a great sense, or who are becoming a network around the world, throughout Eastern Europe, through the Philippines, through India, through North and South America, who themselves have created their own world and their own networks with a sense of solidarity there that's made possible through social media and so on. And what that means is that when you have this sort of gap between two populations that Jamelle is talking about, and you have the option of having solidarity with people everywhere in the world who shares your status, there's less of an incentive for people to develop a sense of solidarity and knowledge of each other within each country. So I would imagine that a lesbian in Poland feels more solidarity with a lesbian in Hungary than a Hungarian nationalist, and a Hungarian nationalist will have more sense of solidarity with the Polish nationalists than either the Hungarians or the Poles will have by themselves. And so one of our tasks politically, and it's not just in the United States, is to build a sense of solidarity that's tied to the place and the nation that we live in, so that we can live together. And it's not just an American problem.
Mm-hmm. Good points, absolutely. It brings me back to the need for, more political and more political coverage at the local level, to Tim's point. But speaking of coverage at the local level, it's time to answer some of the questions from the audience, insofar as I'm receiving them here. So the first one is two interconnected questions for everyone and anyone on the panel. And it's this: do the panelists have any advice for concerned citizens before and on and after Election Day? Any ideas or steps for action? And related to, from the same person, I assume, what should we do if Trump claims victory without winning, or tries to, quote unquote, get rid of the ballots? This is very practical politics now, to bring us back to the election. Anyone want to take that on?
Well, the obvious first thing to do is for people to vote, and to vote early and to follow the rules. If you go either to vote.org or you go to healthyelections.org, which are both nonpartisan sites. The Healthy Elections is a joint Stanford MIT thing. Vote.org is a civil society group. They'll tell you exactly what you need to do where you are. If you go to powerthepolls.org, you can find out about being a poll watcher or a poll worker. You can contact the political parties about doing election protection work. I mean, those are all very concrete things that people can do between now and Election Day. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that depending on how the ballots come in and the like, don't expect to necessarily know all the results on election night.
Exactly.
Americans are used to instant gratification. The polls close at 7 a.m. and at 7:01, the map starts changing colors. And that may not happen this year because there are going to be so many people casting votes by mail. And in a number of different states, they can't start counting the votes that are cast by mail until the polls close. In some states, they've already started processing the ballots and they'll know on election night. But in other states, California, for example, ballots can be arriving 17 days after the election, as long as they're postmarked by election night. So just don't expect immediate gratification, and don't let Donald Trump claim immediate gratification while the red mirage is still on the horizon and we're waiting for the blue wave to come in.
Everybody should have a copy of Dewey Beats Truman, you know, as a kind of reminder. But go ahead, Tim. Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add to the list of things you can do. There's a very fine organization, Protect the Results. You can go to protecttheresults.com. There are plenty of localities in the US which don't have chapters yet. There's still plenty of time to do things. And then to slightly amplify one of Pam's points, it's important that we remain calm on November 3rd, not just because it may well take a while to know the results, but because there will be people, including the President of the United States, who will be trying very hard to make us panic at that particular point. And one ought not to panic. There are days and weeks to count the votes. One should make sure that one's own emotions aren't contributing to the fake crisis that the president might use to try to characterize as an emergency. That said, I think we should also all be ready to endure those weeks with the readiness to protest peacefully, the readiness to do things to make sure that the atmosphere is such that the Supreme Court and everyone else understands that most Americans actually are in favor of democracy, and most Americans would actually like to have their votes counted.
Yes, absolutely. This is wonderful. There's another question that is a little more less practical, but perhaps gets to the same place. And this questioner asks, who exactly profits from the reduction of democracy, in which, as Tim said, we believe, to anarchy? What's the desired gain in this political process, and who receives it?
Well, I'm sure Tim has a lot to say, but one thing I would say at the outset is that it leads people to search for a messianic savior. And, you know, in country after country, we've seen that happen.
Exactly.
It's a little harder to do an electoral system like ours. But, you know, Trump has no problem serving as a messianic figure. It's extraordinary, for instance, that he's become so popular on the German right because of QAnon. And one of their fantasies is that he's going to come in with American troops and free the Germans from the rule of Angela Merkel. And so historically, you expect someone to try to come in as a savior who's going to at least get things running again.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't even know what to say to that. The short answer, though, is Trump, really, in this particular juncture. But to see himself as a kind of savior, I would think, also goes against some of the religious tenets of many of the people who presume to like him. I just wonder what it would take to have them peel away from him. One of the odd thoughts I had was that with the coming, I suppose, confirmation, to go back to the Supreme Court, confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett and the people who are really upset about a woman's right to choose will be satisfied by her election to the or nomination and confirmation to the Supreme Court, and maybe then they'll decide we've had enough with Trump, we got what we wanted, and we'll vote in another direction. But that's just my fantasy. That's I'm told all time we have for audience questions. We could probably talk until November 3rd, but we have other things to do: vote, organize, stay alert, and be well. Thank you all. It was my pleasure talking with you, trying to be a moderator among such really interesting comments. So good night, And thank you to the New York Public Library and the New York Review of Books.
Thanks, Brenda.
Thank you.
You.
Black text on white background, New York Public Library Lion logo, 125 years. Learn more about the New York Public Library, nypl.org.